I've been married to Megan for 7 years. On the surface, it was a good marriage, stable, comfortable, predictable. We met through mutual friends, hit it off right away, and before long, I couldn't imagine my life without her. Megan is beautiful, smart, and has a sharp wit that always kept me on my toes. Our life together wasn't perfect, but whose is? Then there's my mom, Carol. She's the kind of woman people describe as vivacious, even in her late 50s. She's been a force of nature my entire life. Charming, confident, and always the center of attention in any room. Megan adored her right from the start, and honestly, it was a relief. The two most important women in my life got along so well that I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. Looking back now, I can see the subtle cracks that I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice. It's easy to rewrite history when everything falls apart, but at the time I never suspected a thing. Megan would call my mom for advice. The two of them would hang out even when I wasn't around, and I thought, how lucky am I? Not everyone has this kind of harmony in their family. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't even fathom, was that their bond went far deeper than I ever imagined. And when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just my marriage that was shattered. It was everything I thought I knew about my family, about love, and about betrayal. They say hindsight is 20/20, and now I see how blind I was. But back then, I was just a man who thought he had it all. A loving wife, a caring mother, and a life I could be proud of. I had no idea how easily it could all crumble. It started with little things, the kind of details you brush off without a second thought. Megan would come home from lunch with my mom and seem different. She'd be glowing, energized in a way that didn't quite fit the usual vibe of someone who'd spent the afternoon sipping tea and chatting about family gossip. When I'd ask her about it, she'd shrug and say, "Your mom's hilarious. We were just joking around." I didn't press. After all, wasn't it a good thing that they got along so well? Then there were the calls. Megan and my mom were always texting or talking on the phone. At first, I chalked it up to them being close, but the frequency began to feel off. Megan would lower her voice when she was on the phone or step into another room. When I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd casually say, "Oh, just your mom." She was asking about some recipes. Still, I didn't think much of it. I trusted Megan. I trusted my mom. Why wouldn't I? But then Megan's demeanor toward me began to shift. She started snapping at me over small things. Forgotten errands, dishes left in the sink, even the way I folded the laundry. It felt like she was always annoyed with me, like I couldn't do anything right. At the same time, she became unusually affectionate toward my mom. One night, we had my mom over for dinner, and I noticed the way Megan's face lit up when Carol walked in. She greeted her with a hug that lingered just a little too long, a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me in weeks. That night, after my mom had left, I asked Megan about it. "You seem really close with my mom lately," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. She gave me a quick, dismissive laugh. "What are you talking about? She's your mom. Of course I'm close to her." Her answer made sense, but something in her tone didn't. There was an edge to it, a defensiveness that didn't fit. I tried to push the thought out of my head, but it lingered like a faint, nagging whisper. It was just the beginning, though. The whispers would grow louder, and soon, I wouldn't be able to ignore them. A few weeks after that dinner, the nagging whisper turned into a loud alarm. It started with Megan's calendar. She'd always been the type to keep everything meticulously organized. Appointments, plans with friends, even our shared errands were neatly logged in her phone. But lately, I'd noticed gaps. "What are you up to tomorrow?" I asked one evening as we sat in the living room. She'd been glued to her phone, texting furiously. "Oh, nothing much," she replied without looking up. "Might go out for coffee or something." "With who?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Probably just by myself. Some me time." It seemed innocent enough. But the next day, I had to leave work early because of a last-minute meeting cancellation. As I drove home, I passed the coffee shop near our house. There they were, Megan and my mom sitting at a table by the window, leaning in close. I slowed down, trying not to stare too obviously. My mom was laughing at something Megan had said, and Megan's hand rested lightly on my mom's arm. Could have been nothing. Just two women who were close, sharing a moment. But something about the way they looked at each other made my stomach knot. When Megan got home later that afternoon, I casually asked how her day was. "Quiet," she said, dropping her bag on the couch. "I just ran a couple of errands and took a long walk." "You?" I stared at her for a moment, trying to read her face. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't give any sign that she was lying. But she was. "Same," I said, forcing a smile. "Pretty uneventful." After that, I started paying closer attention. I wasn't proud of it, but I began keeping tabs, checking her phone when she left it unattended, noting the times she claimed to be running errands. One evening, I came across a string of texts between Megan and my mom. Most of them were mundane, but one message stuck out. "Looking forward to Friday. Same time." My mom had replied with a heart emoji. "What's Friday?" I asked Megan later that night, feigning casual curiosity. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly. "Just some plans with a friend." She didn't offer more and I didn't press, but my chest felt tight. That was the moment I realized this wasn't paranoia. Something was happening. Something I didn't understand yet, but I was going to find out. Friday came, and with it, my determination to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. Megan had left the house early, claiming she needed to pick up groceries and run some errands. She'd been wearing her new dress, the one she usually saved for date nights, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. After she left, I decided to follow her. Again, I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't ignore the growing weight of suspicion. I trailed her car at a safe distance, my heart pounding with every turn she took. When she pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel on the edge of town, my stomach dropped. I parked across the street, watching as Megan stepped out of her car, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the entrance. She wasn't alone for long. My mom's car pulled up moments later. I froze, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be what it looked like. Couldn't. But then I saw them, Megan and my mom, walking toward the hotel entrance together. Megan glanced around nervously, while my mom placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her inside. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My head was spinning, my heart racing as I sat there, trying to process what I'd just seen. For a moment, I debated leaving, pretending I hadn't seen anything. Maybe ignorance really was bliss. But I couldn't do it. I had to know for sure. I got out of my car and followed them inside, my legs feeling like lead. The lobby was quiet, and I watched as Megan and my mom spoke briefly to the receptionist before disappearing down a hallway. I waited for a moment, letting them get ahead, then followed. My breath was shallow, my pulse roaring in my ears as I approached the hallway. Room 214. That's where they'd gone. I stood outside the door, trembling with anger and disbelief. I wanted to storm in, to confront them right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and snapped a photo of the room number. I stayed there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, torn between rage and heartbreak. Eventually, I turned and left, my mind reeling. I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that it involved my mother. I drove home in a daze, my mind looping through the same unbearable images. Megan's nervous glances, my mom's hand on her back, and the hotel room door closing behind them. By the time I reached my driveway, I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. For hours, I sat in the living room, staring at the clock, replaying every interaction with both of them over the last few months. The lies, the excuses, the secrecy. It all made sense now. When Megan finally walked through the door, she was her usual composed self. She smiled at me like nothing was wrong. "Hey," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "Dinner plans tonight? Or are we just winging it?" Her casual tone made my skin crawl. "Where were you today?" I asked, my voice flat. She froze for just a second, barely noticeable if I hadn't been watching so closely, then turned to face me. "I told you, I was running errands." "Errands, huh?" I said, my tone sharper now. "At a hotel?" Her face went pale. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Megan. I followed you. I saw you with my mom at that hotel. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, she burst out laughing. A cold, brittle sound that only made my anger rise. Are you seriously accusing me of something? With your mother? Yes, I snapped. And don't you dare lie to me. Her laughter stopped, and her face hardened. This is ridiculous, she said, crossing her arms. Carol and I were just talking. She's been stressed lately, and I wanted to help her unwind. At a hotel? I asked, incredulous. She glared at me. It's not what you think. I don't know what you're trying to accuse me of, but it's disgusting. Don't turn this around on me, I said, my voice rising. I know what I saw. You've been lying to me for months. Megan, I want the truth. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually come clean. But instead, she grabbed her bag and stormed toward the bedroom. I'm not doing this with you, she said over her shoulder. I sat there in stunned silence as the bedroom door slammed shut. Her deflection only confirmed what I already knew. She was guilty, and so was my mom. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complete violation of everything I thought I knew about the two most important women in my life. I couldn't ignore it, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let it slide. But I needed a plan. If Megan wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find a way to force it out of her. The next morning, I woke up early, still seething with anger. Megan was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. She looked tired, like she'd barely slept. Good. Neither had I. We need to talk, I said, sitting across from her. She sighed, setting her mug down. I already told you, nothing happened. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Stop lying, I snapped. I'm done playing games. If you don't tell me the truth, I'll go straight to my mom and get it from her. That got her attention. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear. Megan, I continued, my voice low and steady, if you respect me at all, if there's even a shred of decency left in you, you'll tell me what's going on. She looked down at her hands, twisting the wedding ring on her finger. For a moment, I thought she might try to brush me off again. But then she whispered, I didn't mean for it to happen. The words hit me like a freight train. What didn't you mean to happen? I demanded. She finally looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. It started a few months ago. Your mom and we got close. Too close. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. Close? What does that mean, Megan? Spell it out. Her voice cracked as she said it. We've been having an affair. The room spun. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. How could you do this to me? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. It wasn't planned, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face now. It just happened. We were talking one day, and things got complicated. Complicated. I exploded, standing up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. You've been sleeping with my mother, Megan. That's not complicated. It's fucking sick. She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. I didn't want to hurt you, she choked out. Bullshit, I said coldly. You didn't care about hurting me. You cared about getting caught. I couldn't stay in the room a second longer. I stormed out, slamming the front door behind me and getting into my car. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away before my anger consumed me completely. Driving aimlessly, I thought about my mom. She wasn't just complicit in this betrayal. She was a willing participant. My own mother had destroyed my marriage and stabbed me in the back. By the time I parked at a nearby lake, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this slide. Megan and my mom had crossed a line, and they were going to pay for it. Both of them. After driving aimlessly for hours, I finally decided it was time to confront the second half of this betrayal. I couldn't let my mom continue pretending nothing had happened. When I arrived at her house, she answered the door with her usual bright smile, but I could see a flicker of unease in her eyes. Ethan, what a surprise. Come in. I stepped inside without a word, my fists clenched at my sides. "We need to talk," I said sharply, skipping any pleasantries. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "You know exactly what's wrong," I snapped. "I know about you and Megan." Her face went pale, and she froze, like a deer caught in headlights. "Ethan, Don't bother lying," I interrupted. "She told me everything." There was a long silence. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I never wanted you to find out this way." I let out a bitter laugh. "Find out this way? You mean I wasn't supposed to find out at all, right?" She looked away, guilt written all over her face. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It just did." "You're my mother," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Do you have any idea how disgusting this is? How much you've betrayed me?" "Ethan, please," she said, reaching for my arm. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" I yelled, jerking away from her. "How you thought it was okay to screw your own son's wife. How you destroyed everything I thought I could trust." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "I know I've hurt you," she said quietly. "I can't take it back, but I never meant to cause you pain." "Don't give me that crap," I said, my voice ice cold. "You knew exactly what you were doing every single time you went behind my back. The both of you did." I turned toward the door, my rage boiling over. "You know what, Mom? You can have Megan. You two deserve each other. But don't expect me to stick around and watch." "Ethan, wait!" she called after me. I didn't stop. I slammed the door behind me and got in my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. As I drove away, I felt the weight of what I'd just done sink in. My family was in ruins. I'd lost my wife, my mother, and any sense of normalcy I'd once had. But beneath the pain and anger, something else was stirring, something darker. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If they thought they could betray me and walk away unscathed, they were dead wrong. It was time to make them regret every choice they'd made. The house was eerily quiet when I got back. Megan wasn't home, which was probably for the best. I didn't trust myself to see her face again so soon. Instead, I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, letting my anger simmer. They thought they could humiliate me, that they could tear my life apart and just move on, like I was some insignificant casualty in their twisted little game. But they were wrong. If there was one thing I knew about betrayal, it was that it demanded consequences. I spent the rest of the night devising a plan. This wasn't going to be a moment of blind rage or impulsive action. No, I wanted them to feel this, to understand the weight of what they'd done to me. First, I needed evidence. Megan's confession was a good start, but I needed more. Something concrete, undeniable. Something I could use to expose them both, not just to me, but to everyone who mattered in their lives. I pulled out my laptop and began scouring through her phone records, her emails, her social media. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. An entire folder of photos and messages she'd saved, hidden under a misleading name in her cloud storage. Pictures of her and my mom at that damned hotel. Flirty texts that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. It made me sick to read, but I forced myself to go through every last one. By the time I finished, I had more than enough to ruin them. Next, I called a lawyer. I wanted to make sure that when this all came crashing down, I'd be the one holding the cards. I laid out the situation as bluntly as possible, and the lawyer didn't even try to hide his shock. "You've got a hell of a case," he said after a long pause. "Especially with evidence like this. Are you looking for a divorce or something more?" "Both," I said flatly. "I want her out of my life, but I also want her to suffer for what she's done." "And your mother?" "She's not family anymore," I said coldly. The lawyer hesitated. "It's going to get messy. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I didn't even blink. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. After hanging up, I moved on to the next phase of my plan. Exposure. This wasn't going to stay between the three of us. Megan and my mom had destroyed my life, and now I was going to dismantle theirs piece by piece. I drafted emails to Megan's family, my mom's close friends, and a few other key people in their lives, attaching the most damning evidence. I didn't send them just yet. I wanted to wait for the perfect moment. Finally, I sat back and stared at the clock. It was almost midnight. Tomorrow everything would begin. They thought they'd gotten away with it, but they'd underestimated me. I wasn't just going to hurt them, I was going to destroy them. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about reclaiming my power. Megan was in the kitchen, her back to me, making coffee like everything was fine. The sight of her standing there, so casual and unaffected, made my blood boil. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "Is it?" I replied, my tone flat. She froze, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "What's that supposed to mean?" I walked over to the counter, leaning in close enough for her to feel the tension radiating off me. "It means your little secret isn't a secret anymore. Not for long." Her eyes widened, and I could see the panic setting in. "Ethan, please. Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't even try to explain. You had your chance." I walked out before she could say another word. Today wasn't about her. It was about setting everything in motion. The first stop was my mother's house. She opened the door with a strained smile, trying to act like we hadn't had the fight of a lifetime just the day before. "Ethan," she began. "Save it," I said, stepping inside. "We're not here to talk." She followed me to the living room, wringing her hands nervously. "What are you doing?" I pulled out my phone and opened the gallery, scrolling to the folder of photos and texts I'd found on Megan's account. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table in front of her. "Take a look," I said coldly. She hesitated, then picked up the phone. Her face turned white as she scrolled through the evidence. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" I shot back. "The question is, how do you plan to explain it to Dad? To everyone else in this family who thinks you're the perfect matriarch?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that almost resembled regret. "Ethan, You're done," I said sharply. "You and Megan have made your choices, and now you're going to deal with the fallout. I'm sending all of this to everyone. Your friends, your family, your colleagues. Let's see how well you handle the shame." "Ethan, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, I'm still your mother." "No," I said, my voice like steel. "You stopped being my mother the moment you decided my wife was more important than your own son." I didn't wait for her response. I walked out of the house, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction. By the time I got home, I had sent the emails. The evidence was out and there was no taking it back. Later that afternoon, the calls and texts started pouring in. Megan's sister was the first to call, screaming into the phone about how disgusting and unforgivable it all was. My mom's best friend sent a long, horrified message, saying she couldn't believe what she was reading. I ignored most of them, letting the chaos unfold on its own. Megan stormed into the house an hour later, her face red with fury. "What the hell did you do?" she shouted. I leaned back on the couch, arms crossed. "I told the truth. Something you clearly aren't familiar with." She stood there, trembling with rage, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. "Get comfortable, Megan," I said coldly. "This is just the beginning." After unleashing the chaos, I shifted my focus to my mother. Exposing her to the family and her friends was just the first blow. She had built her life on a carefully crafted image, respectable, loving, the glue that held everyone together. Now I was going to rip that apart piece by piece. I didn't even have to wait long. By evening, my father called. His voice was tense, almost trembling. "Ethan," he said, "what the hell is going on? Your mother's in hysterics, and I just got an email full of filth." "It's not filth," I said coldly. "It's the truth. She's been screwing my wife behind my back." The line went silent. When he finally spoke again, his voice was a mix of disbelief and anguish. "Are you sure? This can't be real." "It's real," I said sharply. I've got the proof. I've already sent it to everyone else, so you might as well see it too. He didn't argue. I sent him the full folder of evidence, and not 5 minutes later, my phone lit up with another call. It's true, he said, his voice hollow. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to process this. You don't have to process it alone, I replied. But she doesn't deserve your loyalty, Dad. Not after this. My father was always the quiet type, the kind of man who avoided confrontation at all costs. But when it came to betrayal, even he had his limits. The next day, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a few things. My father greeted me at the door, his face drawn and pale. She's upstairs, he said flatly. I nodded, walking past him without a word. When I reached my mother's room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. The picture of guilt. You've really outdone yourself this time, I said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Ethan, please, I've already lost everything. Don't do this. Don't do this. I repeated, laughing bitterly. You mean don't hold you accountable for the destruction you caused? Don't make you face the consequences of betraying your own son. Tears streamed down her face. I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes. I snapped, cutting her off. No, this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated. And now you're reaping what you've sown. Her sobbing grew louder, but I felt nothing.
No pity, no regret.
You're dead to me, I said coldly. Enjoy what's left of your life, Mom. You've earned it. I turned and walked out without looking back. My father's grim face the last thing I saw before I left. I had severed ties with her completely, and it felt good. But there was still one more thing left to do. Megan had gotten off too easily so far. Now it was her turn to face the full weight of my revenge. As I drove home from my parents' house, my mind was already formulating the next stage of my plan. Megan thought she could weather the storm, but she hadn't seen anything yet. My mother's meltdown was satisfying, but it was Megan who had shattered my trust at its core. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Megan's car was gone. A small part of me hoped she'd finally left for good, but when I walked into the house, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It read, Ethan, I know you hate me, and I don't blame you, but there's something you don't know. Please meet me at the park tonight at 8 p.m. I owe you the truth. I stared at the note, anger rising in my chest. What other truth could there possibly be? She'd already confessed to sleeping with my mother. What more was there to say? For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity gnawed at me. If Megan had more to reveal, I needed to know. When I arrived at the park that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty benches and walking paths. Megan was there, sitting on a bench near the lake, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. I approached slowly, keeping my distance. What do you want, Megan? She looked up at me, her face pale and drawn. Thank you for coming. Cut the crap, I snapped. What's this truth you're so desperate to share? She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she twisted them in her lap. There's more to this than you know. It wasn't just me and Carol. She manipulated me. I scoffed, crossing my arms. You're seriously trying to blame my mother for this? You're just as guilty as she is.
No.
Megan exclaimed, her voice breaking. You don't understand. She came to me first, Ethan. She started this. She said she wanted to be closer to me, to help me feel more loved. Loved? I spat. That's the excuse you're going with? She knew things, Megan continued, her voice trembling. Things about you. She said you'd been distant, that you didn't love me the way you used to. She planted those ideas in my head, and when I was at my weakest, her voice trailed off, and she covered her face with her hands. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Was it possible my mother had orchestrated this? Had she used Megan's insecurities to push her into an affair? Why are you telling me this now? I asked coldly. Because I'm scared, Megan whispered, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. She's not who you think she is, Ethan. She's dangerous. You don't know what she's capable of. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time, doubt began to creep into my mind. Had my mother been pulling the strings all along? I didn't want to believe it, but something about Megan's desperation felt real. The lines between betrayal and manipulation were blurring, and for the first time I wasn't sure who the real villain was anymore. Megan's words left me frozen. My mind raced as I tried to reconcile everything I thought I knew about my mother with what Megan was claiming. Could it be true? Had my mother orchestrated this entire nightmare? I don't believe you, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. Megan flinched but held my gaze. I don't care if you believe me or not. I just couldn't keep quiet anymore. She's not what she seems, Ethan. She never has been. I stared at the lake, the water rippling gently in the evening breeze. A part of me wanted to scream at Megan, to call her a liar and walk away forever. But another part of me couldn't ignore the knot forming in my gut. What do you mean by dangerous? I asked cautiously. Megan hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. She threatened me. When I tried to pull away, she said if I told you, she'd make sure you never forgave me. She said she'd destroy both of us. My stomach churned. The idea of my mother, saying something so cruel felt impossible. But then again, I'd already learned she was capable of betrayal beyond anything I could have imagined. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I demanded. Because I was scared. Megan's voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face. She has this way of making you feel like she's always in control, like there's no escape. I know I've hurt you, Ethan, but I was trapped, and I didn't know how to get out. The rawness in her voice cut through my anger. For the first time in weeks, I saw her not as a traitor, but as someone just as broken as I was. I sat down on the bench, my head in my hands. I don't know what to believe anymore, I admitted. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Megan said softly. I don't deserve that. I just needed you to know the truth. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her confession hanging between us. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, confusion, betrayal, and now a deep, gnawing sadness. Had my mother really manipulated Megan into this? Was she capable of such cruelty? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit. My mother had always been controlling in subtle ways, using charm and guilt to get what she wanted. I'd seen her do it to others, but I never thought she'd turn it on me. Ethan, Megan said quietly, breaking the silence. Whatever you decide to do, just be careful. I looked at her, seeing the exhaustion and regret etched into her face. She wasn't the same woman I'd married, but in that moment, I realized neither of us was the same anymore. Go home, I said finally, my voice heavy. I need to think. Megan nodded and left without another word, leaving me alone with the suffocating weight of everything I'd learned. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something crack deep inside me. The anger that had fueled me for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of loss. My marriage, my family, my trust. It was all gone. I stared at the darkening sky, tears burning my eyes. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was grieving the life I thought I had, the people I thought I could trust, and the man I thought I was. And somewhere in the middle of that grief, I realized that the only way forward was through. If I wanted to find closure, real closure, I needed the full truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, even if my chest still felt heavy. Megan's words haunted me, but they also gave me clarity. If I was going to move forward, I needed answers. Answers only my mother could provide. I drove to my parents' house, my knuckles gripping the steering wheel so hard they turned white. The house looked the same as always, neat, welcoming, deceptively ordinary. But now it felt like the facade of a life I no longer belonged to. When my mom opened the door, she looked startled. "Ethan?" she said cautiously, her voice still shaky from our last confrontation. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past her into the house. She didn't argue. Instead, she followed me to the living room, sitting down on the edge of the couch like she was bracing herself for impact. I talked to Megan. I began, my voice cold. Her eyes flickered, and she swallowed hard. And she told me everything, I said, my gaze unwavering, including how you manipulated her. My mother's face went pale, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. I didn't manipulate anyone. If she's trying to shift the blame, that's on her. Cut the bullshit, I snapped. I know how you work, Mom. You play your little games, planting seeds of doubt and using people's weaknesses against them. You've been doing it my entire life, haven't you? She flinched but still held her ground. Ethan, I'm your mother. I would never hurt you. Don't, I yelled, cutting her off. Don't you dare play the victim. You destroyed my marriage, my trust, my entire goddamn life. And for what? What could you possibly gain from any of this? For the first time, I saw her mask slip. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't soften me. If anything, they made me angrier. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered. Then why did you start it? I demanded. She hesitated, wringing her hands in her lap. Because I was lonely. You've been pulling away from me for years, Ethan. Ever since you married her. She became your world, and I was just an afterthought. Her words hit me like a slap to the face. You're blaming me for this? I said, my voice low and dangerous. I'm not blaming you, she said quickly. I'm just trying to explain. I made a mistake, Ethan. Terrible mistake. But I never wanted to hurt you. Bullshit. I spat. You wanted control. That's all this was ever about. And now you've lost it. She broke down, sobbing into her hands, but I felt nothing.
No pity, no sympathy.
Just a hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. I stood up, staring down at her one last time. You're dead to me, I said coldly. Don't call me. Don't contact me. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a mother anymore. Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I drove away, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I wasn't sure if it was closure or just numbness, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. This was the end of my relationship with her and with Megan. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something new. I wasn't done. Cutting ties with my mother was necessary, but it wasn't enough. Megan still had to face the consequences of her betrayal. She had left me a shattered man, and I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. When I got home, I found her sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up at me, but I didn't acknowledge her. I guess it's over, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I dropped a stack of papers on the coffee table in front of her. She stared at them for a moment before picking them up, her hands trembling. What's this? She asked. Divorce papers, I said flatly. You're signing everything over to me. The house, the car, all of it. You'll leave with nothing. Her jaw dropped, and she shook her head in disbelief. You can't be serious. Ethan, we built this life together. No, I interrupted, my voice cold. I built this life. You just poisoned it. Now you're going to pay for what you've done. She threw the papers down, anger flashing in her tear-streaked eyes. You can't just take everything from me. Watch me, I said, crossing my arms. I've already sent the evidence to my lawyer. The texts, the photos, the hotel receipts, all of it. You're lucky I'm not pressing charges for emotional distress. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. Ethan, please, she begged. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We can fix it. I let out a bitter laugh. Fix it? How do you fix sleeping with my mother, Megan? Tell me, because I'd love to know. She didn't answer, just sobbed into her hands. You have 2 days to pack your things and get out, I said, my voice like steel. And don't think about trying to fight me on this. I've got enough evidence to bury you in court. I walked out of the room, leaving her to cry alone. But I wasn't done. I sent the final email that night, one I'd been holding back until this exact moment. It went to everyone in Megan's professional circle, her boss, her coworkers, even her company's HR department. I attached the same damning evidence I'd sent to the family, making sure they knew exactly what kind of person they had on their payroll. By the next morning, the fallout was swift. Megan was fired from her job, her reputation in ruins. She came to me, furious and desperate, but I didn't care. "You wanted to destroy my life," I told her. "Now you know what it feels like." By the end of the week, she was gone. I watched from the window as she loaded her car with the last of her things, her head hanging low. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction as she drove away, just a quiet, heavy finality. My revenge was complete. But at what cost? The house was quiet now, eerily so. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger coursing through my veins or the relentless drive for revenge propelling me forward. It was over. Megan was gone, and my mother was nothing more than a ghost from a past I'd left behind. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Megan's favorite chair used to be. The weight of everything I'd lost hit me all at once. My marriage, my family, the life I thought I had. Revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but now it felt hollow. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. I thought back to the man I was before all of this, naive, trusting, blind to the cracks forming right in front of me. Would I ever be that person again? Could I even want to be? The truth was, this experience had changed me in ways I wasn't sure I fully understood yet. I'd learned the hard way that betrayal doesn't just come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people you love the most. But I also learned that holding on to anger and pain only eats away at you. My revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't erased the hurt or fixed the broken parts of my soul. All it had done was burn bridges and leave ashes in its wake. As I sat there, I realized I had two choices. Let this bitterness consume me, or find a way to move forward. It wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness wasn't on the table, but acceptance might be. Acceptance that life is messy and people are flawed. Acceptance that I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future. I got up and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, I found pictures of my wedding day, family holidays, and moments that once felt so perfect. They were tainted now, but they were still mine. This was my story, and it wasn't over yet. To anyone reading this, I'll leave you with this. Don't ignore the signs. Don't let your love for someone blind you to their flaws or their intentions. Trust is a gift, but it can be weaponized. And if you find yourself betrayed, don't let it define you. Take your time to grieve, to rage, to heal, but don't let it harden your heart. You deserve better than that. As for me, I'm not sure what the future holds. But for the first time in a long time, I feel ready to find out. One step at a time.